Welcome to the Optimistic Curmudgeon, where the best ideas win. I'm your host, Josh Herring. Today, my guest is Dr. John Wilsey. Dr. John Wilsey is chair of the Church History Department and book review editor at the Southern Baptist Journal of Theology, as well as the associate professor of church history and philosophy at the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary in Louisville, Kentucky. Between 1992 and 2011, Wilsey taught history and Bible in middle and high school classrooms, held positions in Christian school administration, and served on pastoral staff in schools and churches in North Carolina and Virginia. From 2011 to 2017, Wilsey taught history and philosophy at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, with most of his teaching load in a fully accredited bachelor's degree program in a maximum security unit of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. He is married to Mandy, and they have 2 children. He's an elder at Kenwood Baptist Church in Louisville, Kentucky. Dr. Wilsey has also researched and written on conservatism and American diplomacy in the 20th century. He's held roles with the Acton Institute, the Russell Kirk Center, and a variety of other organizations. He writes prolifically, and today we'll be discussing his forthcoming book, Religious Freedom, A Conservative Primer. Dr. Wilsey, welcome to the Optimistic Curmudgeon.
Thanks, Josh. It's great to be with you.
Well, before we get into your book, I have to ask you a question because I listened to some of your interview with the Ciceronian Society with Chris Annadale. Are you in fact a cowboy? Because you were talking about living in Montana, and you just seem like that. It seems like that must make you a cowboy.
No, I am not. I am not a legitimate cowboy, I'm afraid to say. But I have relatives that are, but I am not.
Wow, fantastic! I so enjoyed getting to meet you when we were down in Texas together, and really excited to learn more about your book.
Thanks, Joe.
Tell us a little bit about the story behind your book. Kind of what inspired you to write particularly about religious freedom, and why a conservative primer, and why now of all times?
Yeah, well, I've been a conservative all my life. Was raised by conservatives. Embraced conservative ideas all the way back in probably middle school, and have been a lifelong conservative myself. I became a Christian when I was 19, when I was a college student, and immediately saw the truth and the value of the Christian tradition and the authority of the scriptures as we understand them to be inerrant and infallible. So I've always been had a conservative disposition, and as a Christian, I've extended that conservative disposition in my religious faith. In my PhD program, I wrote on religious liberty in American history, at the founding especially, and I have interest in religious freedom mostly because I'm a religious person, and sort of intuitively want to have religious freedom. But I'm also interested in it as an idea in American history, as part of American tradition that goes back prior to the founding, before the founding. Of course, as you know, Baptists were at the very forefront of religious freedom long before the founding of the United States. So I have a stake in religious freedom as an American, as a Christian, and I also have a historical interest in religious freedom. So you merge those things together, and conservatism and religious freedom, I really want to help people understand how to think about religious freedom as a conservative, especially also as an American, to see this as a uniquely American tradition. In England, they have religious toleration. They had religious toleration for years under the established church. But in America, religious freedom was really new. It was a radical idea in the 18th century, and it's one of the really unique features of the American constitutional system is a disestablishment and free exercise of religion, as the First Amendment says. I see it to be under quite a bit of threat today in the 21st century from a lot of different quarters. But that's why I wrote the book. I wrote the book as an invitation to see how religious freedom is a truly American tradition, and also how to think about that tradition as a conservative.
Well, I, for one, am very much looking forward to seeing the full book when it comes out. I thoroughly enjoyed reading the introduction. Do tell us some of the other details. Who's publishing it? When can we go get on Amazon for pre-orders, that sort of thing?
It'll be published by Erdman's Press, and it should come out in the first quarter of next year, of 2025. So sometime between January and March, hopefully, of 2025. The book is in production now. It's I expect I'll get some edits back, some things to clean up over the course of the summer, and should be ready by the beginning of next year.
Oh, fantastic. I mean, part of what I was found so interesting as I read this was that you hit a couple of different angles that I've encountered at different conferences over the last couple of years. I know some of the kind of mainstream leftist attacks on religious liberty, those almost seem kind of self-evident. The stranger attacks on religious liberty have come from the right, it seems to me. And I mean, the left would like to just pretend that religion doesn't matter. And that's really just not true. The vast majority of American people are still religious people. Even if they don't have as great habits of going to church as they did decades ago, we're still fundamentally a religious people who believe in rule of law and an ordered liberty. And the left would like to ignore that, and that much just is relatively normal in at least over the last 30 years or so. But what seems odd to me is that there are now folks on the right who are arguing really against religious liberty, and they are folks. And you take direct aim at two of them, and I've really appreciated you naming names. Two post-liberal answers on the right. You named Patrick Deneen with Catholic integralism, and then Stephen Wolfe, who's an Orthodox Presbyterian. I loved your phrasing, the gloomy magisterial Protestants and the grim Catholic integralist. I wonder if you could speak to both of those for a moment. Where do you see both of them going wrong in their analysis of our current moment?
Well, with respect to both of those two figures, those authors, I never met Patrick Deneen, but I have met Stephen Wolfe, and I like him tremendously. He's a wonderful person, and I respect him greatly as a thinker, and also respect his military service and his continuing military service to our country. So, tons of respect for both those men. And my criticisms are meant in a spirit of brotherhood and an open and outstretched hand. Nevertheless, I do believe that their visions for a post-liberal society go completely against the American tradition, the American constitutional tradition, to be specific, especially the tradition of disestablishment. Both Catholic integralism and magisterial Christian nationalism embrace an established church in the United States. Now, both sides have a little bit different understandings of the relationship between church and state, but both sides embrace an establishment kind of a system, establishmentarian system, which goes against the very heart of what it means to be an American.
Well, that I wonder if you could say a bit more about being American, because I know that was another piece in in the introduction that you focused on. Where do you see that really touching the core of being an American? Why is that lack of establishment really key to who we are as a people?
In 2023, the Wall Street Journal did a survey. Many of your listeners are familiar with this survey that they did about a year ago. And the survey compared attitudes about religion and patriotism from 1998 until 2023, so over the period of about 25 years. And what the surveys found was that people's attitude, especially young people's attitudes, about the necessity of patriotism and the necessity of religious mores in the culture that sort of guide the culture. There's less enthusiasm for both of those things, and there's less of a perceived necessity for those things in American society. We have witnessed over the last 10, 15 years a greater reticence, especially among, or not especially, but certainly among Christian people, a growing reticence to be identified with patriotism. A greater sort of reaction against the American project, the idea that America is not a great country, that America is a degenerate country. We see this especially emanating from the left, but we also see it emanating from the right too, as a reaction against LGBTQ movements, for example, the transgender movements, bathrooms, and abortion, and you just go down the list. And it concerns me that attitudes about our country are becoming more and more negative and more skeptical, and especially among young people, Gen Z. That's my children's generation. I have an 18-year-old and a 14-year-old, and I'm concerned about their generation. I'm concerned about their lives. You can't have a country without love of country, and you can't have a country without religious mores to provide some kind of social mortar to keep the country together and to keep human flourishing and freedom secure. So religious freedom has always been sort of central to the American project. If we lose religious freedom, we lose America. And if we lose America, we lose our home. And we lose something really good. America is a great country. It's not perfect. Americans are not perfect. Americans have always been sinners. There's never been someone that lived in history that was not a sinner except for Jesus Christ. Everybody else that's ever lived has been a sinner. So we're not a perfect country, but we are a great country. One other thing I'll say about that is that my book is going to be deeply informed by Alexis de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. And if you haven't read that book, I strongly recommend you read it. Tocqueville was a French visitor to America in 1831, a little bit in 1832. And one of the things that he recognized in American society was what he called the harmony between the spirit of religion and the spirit of freedom. He said in his native France that those two spirits have been at enmity with one another. But in America, those two spirits exist in harmony. And what I'm trying to argue in this book is that conservatives are in the best position to maintain that harmony.
Well, I definitely want to get into a bit more of that harmony bit in a moment. Before we go there, though, I wonder if you could you give us some definition of the idea when you say religious mores? What specifically do you mean? Do you mean? And I think of we're not too many generations away from blue laws, or and still when I go into the grocery store. If I go to the grocery store right after church, it's not a curtain, but it looks a bit like a plastic curtain is pulled down on top of the beer. But if I'm there at 12:05, that curtain is raised and people can buy beer. And that's just a remnant of a day when there were far more religious customs in North Carolina than there are today. But is that what you mean, or do you mean something different by religious mores?
Yes, when I use the term religious mores, I'm drawing that term more from Tocqueville. Tocqueville writes about the mores in America, and he defines mores in this way. He says that the mores represent the whole moral and intellectual character of Americans. He went on to say that mores represent the habits of the heart. He said that the mores are more influential even than the laws in America, because the laws are rooted in the mores. The laws are the product. They emerge out of the mores in America. We can think about the mores as being the sort of the both the intellectual and the emotional foundations of American culture. What Americans value the most. What defines American habits and practices, how our assumptions and our presuppositions about reality are formed, and how we relate to one another in relationship to one another. These things are all part of the mores. They're part of our culture. And in the 1830s, when Tocqueville was here, he noticed that religion was the most important shaper of the mores. And the people that were the most sort of the guardians of the mores in America were the wives and the mothers in the families. So the mores sort of they're derived from scripture. They're derived from the Bible. They're derived from the Christian religion, as Tocqueville would have said. They are implanted in the families by the women of America. And then they grow and they spread out through American culture in the public square as the men take those mores out into the public square. Now, our American society is a lot different than it was in the 1830s, and I'm not ever advocating for some kind of return to the 1830s. But the point there is that the mores are more important than the laws, and religious mores, Christian mores, need to, I advocate for, they need to form our culture. They need to be formative for our culture. They once were, and I think we can cover that in some sense if we understand what religious freedom is and how we should think about religious freedom as conservatives.
I think that's a great point of contrast between my more Christian nationalist friends. I interviewed Ben Cnreshaw on this show probably 6 or 8 months ago, and he made a compelling case for the fact that we actually need sort of a top-down establishment to set formal religious practices, sort of. And I hope I'm not caricaturing his argument, but I still think he's basically describing a really thin theism that the government espouses and thinks that will cause effective change. Whereas you don't seem to be advocating that at all, but instead that really we need it. Religious practices have to come from the base and then rise up if they're then going to be part of the fabric of American life. I think of 2015 seems like such a pivotal year to me in American jurisprudence and cultural life with the Obergefell decision. But the Obergefell decision was preceded by 20 or more years of media that celebrated homosexual stories. And so we in that sense, there was a very broad cultural change that then was eventually reflected. That gave rise to Justice Kennedy being able to give us the astounding legal reasoning of let love be love. I mean, like that's the highest jurisprudence we can possibly get, apparently. But so I think that's really interesting that where the Christian nationalists want to say, oh, we ought to have some church established at the top and at least have all of the public rhetoric and paraphernalia. Your argument seems to be that instead we do need these mores, but they have to come from the people. Am I understanding that correctly? They do.
They have to come from the local communities. Being a conservative means that you put the stress on the local communities above the importance of the centralized government, above the importance of Washington D.C. and sort of a top-down approach. And that's a Tocquevillian idea too. Tocqueville stressed the importance of the local communities as well. He said that democracy was the local town, the locality was a school for democracy where citizens learn democratic practices and democratic habits. And those democratic practices will rise. They'll emanate from the local communities and they'll rise up to the state governments and then by extension the federal government as well.
Before we move on to a different area, I want to ask if you could say a bit more about patriotism. I think that's a really interesting word. I remember being a boy growing up in Tennessee, and being a patriot was a good thing. It was something we were supposed to aspire to. The 4th of July was an annual celebration of patriotic fervor. I distinctly remember we lived in Montgomery County, and you were not allowed to have fireworks inside the county line. But as soon as you crossed over to outside into the county, there were these big firework tents everywhere.
Right.
But I mean, more recently, Donald Trump has certainly attempted to capitalize on some sort of connection between Christianity and patriotism with the sale of, I think it was a $60 Bible and so on. So what help us understand patriotism? What is a healthy patriotism, and how would you distinguish that from some sort of nationalistic fervor? Or would you make that distinction?
Yeah, absolutely. I would make a distinction between those things. Nationalism, and this is like an interview for a whole nother episode, right? But in short, nationalism is a very modern term. Nationalism emerges in post-Napoleonic Europe, especially in Germany, and finds its purest expression in the Second Reich in Germany under the Kaisers, and then also in the Third Reich under Hitler. But nationalism is broader than just Germany. It's a Western concept in the 19th century, and it spreads out to the colonial peoples in the 1950s and 60s and henceforth after that. Christian nationalism or religious nationalism, the way that I've talked about it in my earlier writings and books, is when Christian theology is appropriated to American identity. So when you have America seen as a chosen people, a new Israel with a divine mission in the world, occupying a sacred land, with an innocent sort of character, an innocent, morally regenerate character, with a glorious past that needs to be recovered. Those are elements in Christian nationalism, and those things I think we need to be really careful and really cautious about if we're Christians. The gospel is about the Lord Jesus. The gospel is not about democracy, and that seems to be a truism for most of us. But there have been really influential people in American history who have equated the gospel with American style democracy. So nationalism, I would say, is something we want to avoid. Patriotism is an ordered love of country, where you have, if you're a Christian and you read in the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus teaches his disciples how to pray. Well, he gives them the Lord's Prayer. I think the Lord's Prayer is a great model for how to order our loves, including our love for country. So think about how it starts. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. What's the first thing that we do? What's the first love? Our first love is the Lord in heaven. We hallow his name. We recognize him as holy. We recognize our dependence upon him. And then it goes on, and Jesus says, thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. That's the second ordering of loves. We love the Lord first. We want to see his will done on earth. And so our love for our country is part of seeing the will of God done on earth. What is our earthly kingdom? Well, our earthly kingdom for now is the United States. If we're a citizen of the United States, this is what we are concerned with. And so we want to see the will of God done on earth in our country. Now, going back to that localism aspect, love for country doesn't start from the top down. Love for country starts in the home. Starts with our people. I have a wife. I have 2 children. I have a brother. I have I have a nephew. I have nieces and nephews. I have my parents-in-law. Our family grows out and emanates out. And my loyalty starts with them, with my people. It starts also with my neighborhood and my community and my town and the students I see at the school I teach at and my people in my church. These are my people. I love them first before I love somebody, a stranger in Arkansas. But nevertheless, that stranger in Arkansas does fit in a emanating concentric, circles going out. So that's how I understand an ordered patriotism to look like. We start with love for the Lord, and our love for the Lord will train our love for other things as they are ordered appropriately. I think Christian nationalism misses that. Anyway, so there's plenty we can talk about there, but I'll stop there.
Oh, you're right. There's a lot we could go into there. I'll make 2 comments. First, you reminded me of a section in Lewis's book, The Four Loves, where he addresses patriotism as a right. He uses some of the same language of a rightly ordered love. And he contrasts it with really sort of a globalist who says he has no home. But then the nationalist who says, my home is better than everyone else's home, therefore I will destroy you. And he says the rightly ordered one is the one who has a right love of home. And that secondly reminds me of Edmund Burke's idea of the little platoons, and that it's we begin life in those little platoons, and it's in those little platoons that we learn these essential habits of loyalty and of love of neighbor. And I think that's a helpful. I think those are very helpful comments as we're looking at patriotism. Now, I wonder. You mentioned Alexis de Tocqueville several times already. Could you tell us a bit more about his background? I know in the introduction you went into a decent amount of focus on his family. It seemed like his family background prepared him for his time when he was in America. Could you say a few things about kind of how his background and how that prepared him for his analysis in the United States?
Yeah. Tocqueville was born in 1805 and he died in 1859. His mother and father had just gotten married in early 1793. And, or maybe it's 1793. I have to look that up again to make sure that's right. But just months after they had gotten married, they were thrown into prison because his mother, whose name was Marie Pelletier, his mother was, her family had been defenders of the king. In fact, her father was the defense attorney for the king in his trial. Of course, he was executed on January 21st of 1793. And after the king's execution, her father was executed on the scaffold of the guillotine. And he was forced to watch as one of his other daughters was also executed. So he had immediate family members that were put to death on the guillotine. And his mother and father were in prison awaiting execution. But Robespierre, who, of course, was behind the Reign of Terror, the main inspiration behind the Reign of Terror, was himself executed later in 1793. And then his parents were released. But they were in prison for several months. They were very young. They were in their early 20s. And they never got over the experience. Neither his father nor his mother ever got over the experience of being imprisoned and also knowing that their family members had been executed. So all that to say, all this happens, of course, before Tocqueville was born. But the revolution cast a very long shadow on Tocqueville's life. He could never escape sort of the consciousness, the awareness of what had happened to his family as a result of the revolution. And he wrote a book about the revolution after he wrote Democracy in America called The Ancien Regime, which is a history of the French Revolution. And it's a very fine book, and everybody should read it. He became a lawyer himself. He was educated. He was a law school educated young man. And when he was 26, he came over to America. And he, as a member of an aristocratic family, he reflects a great deal on American democracy and natural equality in America, in contrast to feudalism and natural hierarchies created by aristocracies that had been existent in France for many, many centuries, going all the way back to the fall of Rome. So that's his frame of reference, is an aristocratic society, a feudalistic society, a society that was predicated on natural hierarchy. And he's confronting a society that is defined by natural equality. And it's that contrast is evident throughout his musings and his reflections on what he observes in America in 1831 and until he leaves. He got here in May of 1831 and he left in February of 1832.
And I will freely confess, I have read excerpts of de Tocqueville, but I've not read by any stretch all of Democracy in America. I've not read any of Ancien Regime. I really want to pick that one up. I think that'd be a great way to look at somebody who's thinking through the consequences of the French Revolution in that immediate next generation is fascinating.
Right.
I've read Burke's Reflections, but I think it sounds like de Tocqueville's Ancien Regime would be a great follow-up book to Burke's Reflections. Yeah.
Ancien Regime is a tremendous book to read in alongside of the Reflections, Burke's Reflections, definitely.
Well, we've got a question in the comments, particularly about those two. So maybe it's a good time to take that. This comes from Claire Aguda. Claire asks, how should we compare Tocqueville's Tocqueville's mores with Burke's manners?
I think that they're very similar. The similarity between the two, I think, comes in both of their stresses on localism. Mores in Tocqueville's mind, and I'm more familiar with Tocqueville on this subject, but in Tocqueville's mind, mores they're not given to American society top down. They emanate from the family. They emanate from the local community. And Burke's, of course, his understanding of manners is also going to be local. His entire understanding of what England is and what the British Empire is starts with little platoons and the whole concept of a little England. Of course, he's from Ireland, but he is very, very much focused on the local. And both Tocqueville and Burke, when they critique the French Revolution, they critique it from this element of a top-down, forced and coerced kind of a system of abstractions. These abstractions like liberty and equality and fraternity. If we're going to embrace liberty, then we have to embrace fraternity. And equality is actually not consistent with liberty. And Tocqueville certainly stresses that throughout Democracy in America. And I think that it's implicit in, I think it's probably more than implicit in Burke's writings, because Burke actually defends the traditional aristocracy of England. But nevertheless, all that to say that to answer Claire's question, and Claire, thank you very much for that question. I think that the emphasis on locality is what's the thing that's held in common between the two of them.
As you were answering Claire's question, you reminded me of a passage I love in Richard Weaver's book, Ideas of Consequences, particularly his chapter on hierarchy. He has this great paragraph where he says fraternity is far better than equality, because equality sort of erases our ways of relating to each other, and it hands us what promises to be some sort of sameness, but in reality, it strips us of all obligation. And he then considers the opposite case where fraternity, if I get the line correctly, can exact the highest obligation from older brother while requiring him to have the greatest amount of patience towards his younger brother. And fraternity can, it creates this network of relationships where we are actually bound together by, but it gives us the ways to rightly relate to one another that equality doesn't actually give. Yeah,
that's exactly right. That's one of the classic sections of Richard Weaver's book. I was a little brother when I was growing up, and I had to learn my place on the family hierarchy. And learning my place in the family hierarchy did something to train me for understanding my place in society. And that gets to the distinction between, or the contrast between, equality and fraternity. Those that would embrace equality and emphasize it over fraternity very likely see the individual as being the basic unit of society. But if you embrace fraternity, you probably see the family as the basic unit of society. And that's really a traditional Republican view, a traditional Republican understanding of what society is that it starts with the family, not with the atomized individual.
Well, by the time you get towards the about 2/3 of the way through this introduction, you start making this really interesting argument that conservatives are best positioned to steward the American experiment. I would love for you to unpack that idea for our audience, and particularly help us a bit more with what do you mean by, you distinguish that as the Burkean strand of conservative thought, which seems distinct from the Republican Party or maybe even the conservative movement, what sometimes gets called Conservative Inc., that sort of thing. What do you mean by Burkean conservatism, and why is it uniquely positioned to steward this particular experiment?
Well, conservatism is not first and foremost a political ideology. And that's something I really want to get across in the book. The term conservative especially in the last 10 or 15 years, has been understood primarily in political terms. You're a conservative, that must mean you're a Republican. You're a conservative, that means you have a particular political philosophy. You have a particular set of political positions on various, policy positions. So you must be for a strong defense. You must be pro-life. You must be, for, school vouchers, and you must be this, that, and the third thing. If you're a conservative, but a conservative is someone a conservative mindset is a disposition. It's an attitude. It's an approach to life. I also add one other category. You hear this a lot. You see it in Burke, but you see it all the way through conservative writers, all the way through to post-war American conservatism, like people like Russell Kirk and Richard Weaver, who thought of conservatism as a disposition. Something I want to add to that, and that is, and not only is it a disposition, but it's also an aspiration. And by that I mean that there are no true conservatives. Conservatives are famous for wanting purity. So one of my heroes in conservative history is Peter Viereck, who was a very important post-war conservative, especially in the late 40s and early 50s. But he was regarded as a counterfeit conservative because he was on record for having supported Adlai Stevenson in 1952. And so he was sort of rejected by the conservative movement because he was a supporter of Adlai Stevenson, and he was also a supporter of the New Deal. He had reasons for this. He had actually conservative reasons for supporting Stevenson and the New Deal. But all that aside, he was not seen as pure enough, and he was expunged, he was expelled, he was canceled by the conservative movement in the 50s. But there are no pure conservatives. There are no pure conservatives. We aspire to be conservatives. Some of us are farther down the path of conservatism than others. Some of us are just learning what it means to be a conservative. Some of us are still learning how to apply a conservative disposition to every element of our life. But none of us are actually there. We're all aspiring conservatives. Another thing about aspiration as a facet of conservatism is that conservatism is optimistic. That's why I like your little handle there, the optimistic curmudgeon. In fact, that's exactly what I'm trying to say an aspirational conservative is. Your optimism is not like a progressive optimism. It's not utopian. Josh, you're not trying to build castles in the sky. You're also not trying to, come up with some kind of magic formula that's a pure abstraction that's going to solve all our problems. Like, I think Stephen Wolfe's program really, really is that. He's trying to solve all our problems. If we could just go back to Massachusetts in the 18th century, all of our problems would be solved. Optimism and a sort of a positive outlook and an aspiration in conservatism is always going to be tempered by a realistic view of human nature. Human beings exist, or human nature exists in a tension. A tension between, on the one hand, think Psalm 8. In Psalm 8, David says that the Lord created humankind and crowned him with glory and honor. Said that we were a little bit lower than the angels. That's human dignity described there. But on the other hand, we know what Romans 3 and Romans 6 and Isaiah 59 all tell us. That we're sinners and that we're in need of a Savior. And so that tension exists, and that tension is resolved on the cross. And it's resolved greater than on the cross. It's resolved in the incarnation, in the person and the work of the Lord Jesus Christ. That's where that tension is resolved. So being an optimistic curmudgeon, you are communicating that tension that an aspirational conservative understands. Human nature is in tension. We can look ahead with optimism to the future. We can embrace the American project with optimism. We can even embrace it with an idea or an eye towards a lowercase sort of progressivism, We're looking for improvement. We're looking for the continuation of human flourishing in the American tradition. But we understand that human nature is flawed and sinful. We also know that injustice in the world is never going to be never going to be changed simply by looking at external structures and systems in society. Injustice stems from our flawed human nature. It stems from the interior person, and then it is translated into those systems and structures. So if you're going to deal with injustice, you have to deal with this, the human heart, before you can deal with the systems and structures in the society. Because conservatives understand all those things. Conservatives are in the best position to maintain that harmony between religion and freedom, because religion and freedom are also pre-political. And if you're going to maintain the harmony between two ideas that are pre-political and are based in human nature and human aspiration, then your disposition must be conservative. It has to be. If it's not, then that harmony is not going to be sustained. So conservatives are in the best position to do that. So then, what's a conservative, and how do conservatives think about religious freedom? That's what the book is about.
Well, and of course, there's we're never going to go into everything that's going to be in your book in one conversation. I will just say, I don't know that I've said this recently on the show, but and as much as I am the standard host for the show, I guess I'm an optimistic curmudgeon, but the show is actually named for our school's founder. So I'm a professor at Thales College, and our founder is a gentleman named Bob Luddy. When I think of optimistic curmudgeon, I really think of Bob, because he is simultaneously an incredible idealist. He's an entrepreneur, and he is all about changing the world through education. But at the same time, he is an incredible realist, and he insists on looking at the reality of the state of our culture's decline. So he thinks that education is one of the best ways to repair some of that decline. But it's everything you were just describing about that balance between where we are and what we aspire to be. I also heard a little bit of Wilfred McClay in how you were answering that, Dr. Wilsey, because he uses some of that same language to talk about America as a country that has always aspired to great ideas. We look at particularly, and you looked at some of this too in the introduction, but he looks at the Declaration of Independence and says we certainly aspire to have all men realize these unalienable rights that we have, but we almost never live up to our aspirations. And it's something that every generation has to wrestle with in American history. To what extent do we live up to the aspirations of the American dream? And that seems to be a tension in American history that I don't know will ever be solved. But I like your idea of a little p progressivism, that we are looking for what Bob Luddy at least would call continuous improvement. Be able to look at one step better than we were a few years ago.
That's exactly right. And I recommend Bill McClay's book, Land of Hope, his American History. I assign it in my American history classes. I recommend it all the time. It is the best, upper level high school and also introductory level college American history textbook. It's excellent, because what he does get at that tension between what Lincoln described too, what Lincoln often would remind us in his speeches and writings, that there's the reality on the ground, and then there's also the aspiration. The Declaration of Independence sets up the aspiration for us. He says all honor to Jefferson, because of those lines in the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is an aspiration. It's Lincoln likened it to Jesus's admonition to be perfect. Lincoln pointed out that Jesus made that admonition. He said, be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. That's an aspiration. We aren't perfect in this life. We'll never be perfect. But if we aim for perfection, if we aim for doing the will of God and securing the will of God on earth as it is in heaven, then we're going to at least be on the path towards perfection. And in the same sense, the Declaration of Independence is an aspiration for us. It's a goal for us to pursue. And if we survey American life in 2024, for example, and compare it to, say, 1954 or 1934 or 1834, you can see measurable progress, actual concrete strides towards the aspiration that's expressed in the Declaration. And those on the left especially want us to forget about that. They want to say, well, that's, they want to make excuses for why that's a bad reason or sort of a bad way to see history. They want people to see America as an experiment in degeneracy, rooted as it supposedly is in the institution of slavery if we follow the 1619 Project and if we follow critical race theory. But that's simply untrue. And it's also extremely dangerous because if we embrace that kind of a philosophy, then we really don't have a country anymore. We really have no reason to have a coherent nation any longer. And what will that mean? What will that mean for us? What does that mean for us if we lose America? What does it mean for our children? What does it mean for those generations yet to be born? As Burke famously said, that society was that contract between the dead, the living, and the yet to be born. What does that mean? What does it look like? What does a world without the America that we know and love look like? Nobody knows, and nobody can guess. And do we really want to embrace that? Do we really want to we really prefer something that we cannot see, that we cannot know, rather than improve and to build upon what we have in our history in the federal project that goes back to 1787? What Stephen Wolfe's trying to do is he's trying to recover something. He's trying to recover a Calvinist political theology for American purposes today. And I would say that the project of retrieval is definitely needed. I would agree with him, and I would agree with Christian nationalists who think that. But the project of retrieval needs to be to retrieve American federalism. That's what we need to retrieve. And how do we do that? Well, we have to do a little bit of reading. We have to read the Federalist Papers. We have to understand American history. We have to understand our failures and our successes along the way. That's how we retrieve the federal project as it was originally envisioned by the framers.
Fantastic. There's so much there that I want to ask you more about, but I'm going to go on to a new question instead. Now, as we start to kind of wrap up our conversation today, I want to ask you a question that I think it's related to your previous statements, but particularly about your craft as a historian. You wrote in this introduction that, quote, history, when interpreted in light of permanent things, can be an antidote to despair. Unmoored from permanent things, history is a nightmare. But when universals such as virtue guide our interpretation of the past, history is redemptive. What are these permanent things, and how do they shape your work as an historian?
Well, I get that term, the permanent things, from Russell Kirk, from T.S. Eliot, from those early post-war conservatives who really defined the movement. The permanent things start with metaphysics. They start with God. They start with being, the being of God, the existence of God. And God understood as the ground of all being. Sometimes you hear people ask the question, does God exist? Really, that's an absurd question. Because if you exist, then God exists. Because we have our existence, because God is the one that granted our existence. God is the ground of all being, the ground of all existence. And so if we exist, then God exists. This is also kind of drawing on the ontological argument from Anselm, going back to the late 11th and early 12th century. But the idea there, it goes back to that rightly ordered love. We start with God as the ground of all being. We proceed then to truth. Truth is objective. Truth is bigger than me. Truth stands whether I like it or don't like it, whether I believe it or I don't believe it, whether I know it or don't know it, whether I live or die. Truth stands. It's objective. It's authoritative. I have to live by that truth. I may not always get the truth right, and I may not have comprehensive access to that truth, but the truth is knowable, the truth is there, and the truth is objective. Now, with regard to that, from there we go to ethics. How do we live? How do we treat one another? How do we treat ourselves? How do we live in community with one another? And that's where the virtues come in. If Burke is right, and society really is a contract between the dead and the living and the yet to be born, then that means our understanding of history has to be informed by virtues. Virtues like, say, for example, courage. Back in 2020, when we saw the riots occurring all over the country and the statues were coming down all over the country, not just Confederate statues, but statues and names of schools and place names named after people like Abraham Lincoln were coming down and being questioned, and people were expressing skepticism, all that kind of thing. It's obvious. It's always burdened me as a history teacher that I don't think that students are taught that when they look at history, that they're supposed to feel uncomfortable with it. You're supposed to be uncomfortable with the past because the past is a foreign country, as historians like to say. And in a foreign country, any foreign country, you're supposed to be uncomfortable. If I go to Thailand, I'm going to be uncomfortable. I'm a Georgia boy. I'm going to be uncomfortable in Thailand. If I go to England, I'm going to be uncomfortable. If I go to Canada, I'm going to be uncomfortable. My mother lives down in Mexico. When we go visit her, it's uncomfortable. It's outside of my comfort zone. And when you read history, you're entering into another world, and that other world's different than yours, and you're going to be uncomfortable. The question is not, should you feel uncomfortable with history? It's, to what extent will you feel uncomfortable with it? And when we see people in the past who believed objectionable things and did objectionable things, when we've experienced that discomfort, we have to have some courage. We have to demonstrate courage to wade into it, to expose those events out into the light, to understand it on its own terms, and not to try to recast that world in our present assumptions and our present understanding. It takes courage to do that. It takes patience to do that too. It takes patience to read. It takes patience to toil in historical writings. It takes charity to extend to the dead the benefit of the doubt, and to recognize that they're human and so am I. I'm just as human as they were. I'm just as much of a sinner as they were. And if I had lived in those days, who's to say that I wouldn't have embraced the same ideas that they embraced, both those things that were sinful and those things that were not. So that's just a few examples of how we allow the permanent things to guide our understanding of history. If we don't allow those permanent things to guide our understanding of history, then history does become a nightmare. And what I mean by that is history becomes a never-ending conflict, an unresolvable conflict between the oppressed and the oppressors. In other words, without the permanent things to guide our understanding of history, then we all become Marxists.
Whew. Oh, man. Well, Dr. Wilsey, I am confident that your students love you, and I'm sure you've had many, many, many classes of students who fall in love with history because of the way that you approach that. And it's your love of history is clear from the way you describe it. Let me ask you one final question today. And you mentioned him several times in our conversation, but it was clear from reading your introduction that Russell Kirk is an author who has definitely shaped your thinking. I had one spot where I was like, I wrote Russell Kirk's name in the margin, and then the next paragraph you directly cited Kirk. I recently worked through Kirk's Roots of American Order with an ISI group that we've got here at Thales College. My students really enjoyed reading Kirk together. I was struck by your alignment with Kirk in your emphasis on particularity versus abstract theory. You wrote, quote, "It is conservatives who conserve the values and traditions handed down by previous generations. Those who want to remake American society along the lines of a priori, deductive, abstract theorizing, whether on the left or the right, are radical. We do not need to remake America. The constitutional order established by the founders in the Revolutionary period has not become, I wrote the word absolute, but I think that's the wrong word. The sense of that sentence was that it's not become undone. So I want to ask you, what hope do you see for conservatives continuing to conserve the American experiment?
I have a great deal of confidence. I'm not going to give you an abstract answer to that question. I'm going to give you a very concrete answer to that question in the spirit of a good conservative disposition. I have a lot of confidence and I have a lot of hope and a lot of optimism about the future of conservatism in America because of what classical Christian education is doing and schools like Thales College, but schools all over the country, both in the primary and the secondary, and then also in the undergraduate and even in the graduate programs. An emphasis on tradition, an emphasis on the classics of Western civilization, an emphasis on great literature, great writing, an emphasis on classical languages, and an emphasis on history and how to think historically. The recovery of great practitioners of the historical profession, like Richard Weaver and like John Lukacs, for example, who I talk about in my book quite a bit. I have a great deal of hope and confidence in the homeschool movement, which is so many homeschoolers are informed by classical Christian curricula and emphases and foci. The next generation, this book, I dedicated it to my daughters, and I dedicated it to the generation that they're members of, so-called Gen Z. I wrote this book for young people. I wrote this book for young people like that are, my daughter's age and a little bit older, maybe a little bit younger, intentionally, because I want to see them embrace a conservative attitude, conservative disposition that will inform their politics, but it will be far beyond just politics. It'll be truly humanistic, because true conservatism, a true conservative disposition, is made for man, and not man for conservatism.
That's a great line. And I think it's true, because conservatism, like so many other things, can become a terrible master if misordered. But it really, that attunement to what are the traditions that we have received that are vital for our own flourishing that we need to pass on to the next generation, I think that's vital. Well, Dr. Wilsey, where can people find and follow your work online if they want to read more of what you've written?
Yeah, well, I've written 3 books and have 1 edited volume. I wrote a book on religion and the founding. I wrote a book on American exceptionalism. I wrote a biography of John Foster Dulles, who was Secretary of State under Eisenhower. And then I have an abridged edition of Tocqueville's Democracy in America, and all those are on Amazon. And then I write frequently for outlets like Liberty. I write for, I've written for Gospel Coalition. I've written for Christianity Today in years past. And, I write for Providence, which is a foreign policy journal. So I can, if you just do a Google search, you'll be able to find my writings online. And then there's quite a bit of podcasts I've done to discuss my books, especially. And those are often found on YouTube. I've also done some speaking for various groups on Tocqueville. And there's a number of lectures that I've given on YouTube as well. So if anybody's interested, they can look in all those places.
Wonderful. Well, Dr. Wilsey, thank you so much for coming on the show today. This has been a delightful conversation.
Yeah, sure have enjoyed it, Josh. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you, listeners and viewers, for joining us today for another episode of The Optimistic Curmudgeon. My guest this episode has been Dr. John Wilsey of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. The book is Religious Liberty, a Conservative Primer, coming out hopefully next January, January 2025 from Erdman's Press. If you like this episode, please do leave us a 5-star review and share it with your friends. Until next time, seek the good, discover the true, and love the beautiful.